Hey everyone! So today we're going to talk about Psalm 139, 13 through 16. It's just a short little verse, as you can see. This is part 3 of a 4-part series. So if you haven't watched the first 2, make sure you go back and watch those first. It'll make a lot more sense. I will link to those down below and in the info cards. But we will do this, and then next week part 4 will be out, and that completes this series. Alright, let's just hop right in. As usual, I will read this to you guys first. This is in the Christian Standard Bible version. As always, I encourage you to pause this video and read this in a couple different versions. I like the New King James Version, the New International Version, the CSB, which is this one, and the English Standard Version. I think reading it in multiple versions helps you get a better understanding of the text. So go ahead and hit pause now and go read this a couple times. For it was you who created my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I will praise you because I have been remarkably and wondrously made. Your works are wondrous, and I know this very well. My bones were not hidden from you when I was made in secret, when I was formed in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw me when I was formless. All of my days were written in your book and planned before a single one of them began. Alright, so that is a very small little part of this whole study, but there's a lot to it. So first I want to break it down verse by verse, and then we will just kind of dig into the overarching theme that's in these few verses. So the major theme throughout this entire section here is that God cares about us, and surrendering to Him is a victory in itself. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we go through this. So verse 13 starts, for it was you who created my inward parts. Oh, my pen is acting funky already. Inward parts also reads as kidneys, depending on the version that you're looking at. And kidneys actually refers to what was thought to be the source of man's desires and longing. So during this time that the book was written, in the Hebrew culture, they thought that the kidneys were actually where your desires lie. And there's a lot of kind of history behind that, but we're just going to kind of keep this short and sweet today. So this is where your desires were thought to come from. And that's important just because it was God who created our desires. It was God who formed us. It was God who gave us our personalities and gave us the things that we love. And so just understanding that and knowing that God cares about what our desires are for our life, and God cares about who we are, it just starts off with a really great message that God actually does care about us, and He truly does love us. He knit us together in our mother's womb. So even before we were born, He had a plan for us. He knew what our life's desires would be, and because God isn't eternal, He sees all of that before we are even created. So verse 14 talks about our creation as a miracle. I will praise you because I've been remarkably and wondrously made. And this phrase right here, I'm sure you guys have seen on quotes and, artwork and on Pinterest, because it's very famous. And essentially what it means is that our creation is a miracle. We don't understand human anatomy, but here we are. We don't fully understand how the brain works, but here we are. Just because we don't understand how we were formed or where we came from doesn't mean that it's not possible. And this is really important because David, as he's writing this, he's not asking God to understand. He's not asking God for an explanation of what's going on. He just praises God for the authority that He has over these things. And that is so important, because if you go through your entire life and you try to understand the meaning of life, and you try to understand why God does these things, or why people suffer, why people are hurting, you're going to spend your whole life wondering. And that's not really the purpose of life. That's not the point of all of this. The point is to trust that God knows all of that, and God has authority over that, and to put your trust and your faith in Him rather than what you can discover on your own. Okay, verse 15. My bones were not hidden from you when I was made in secret, when I was formed in the depths of the earth. God knew us and had purpose for us before we were ever conceived. And that is so important to remember, because when you start to think that your actions somehow are not predetermined by God or pre-known by God, then you forget how powerful he is. It's so important to remember that God is an eternal God. He sees everything all at once as it's happening, as clearly as day. And he can see all of this without needing time to kind of limit him. So even when he was, planning for Jesus to die on the cross, even while that was happening, he knew about us. He knew that we were going to be formed and that we were going to have a purpose on this earth. And when you look at your life that way, it's so hard not to see meaning in your own life. And it's also important to remember that even though God knows everything, God is eternal and he has authority over all of this, we still have choice. We still have free will. So just because God knows what we're going to do doesn't mean that he has control over that. He's not going to stop us from sinning or stop us from doing stupid things that harm us. But he does know how he's going to use those things for good. And you can look back at, something in your past and just think about that. What's something that you did that you knew in that moment was going to harm you? What's something, maybe a relationship that was heartbreaking or something that was really hard that you had to go through? Maybe it was a loss of a loved one. Look at those things as a past heartbreak or a past hurt and see how they've altered your life now. I know there are so many instances where I can look back at my life and say, in the moment, that was me making a stupid decision, but I can see now how God used that for good. And you don't have to do that with every situation. And there's some situations that happen where you may never see the good of that in your lifetime. But it's important to remember that God uses all things for good and that he has a plan for all of this because he is the authority over all of this. All right, verse 16. Your eyes saw me when I was formless, and all the days were written in your book and planned before a single one of them began. Again, God is eternal. He is everywhere at all times. So he sees our thoughts as a 5-year-old as simply as he knows our struggles at 65 years old. We cannot surprise God, and there is so much hope and so much comfort in that. God knows every single sin we will commit on this earth before we even commit it. And he still forgives us, even knowing that. He still sends his son for us, even knowing what we will do. And there is so much hope in that because we can't lose God's grace. No matter what we do, he will never be surprised and go, ooh, I didn't know she was going to do that. I don't know if this whole grace thing is going to extend to that point, because God is eternal and he saw all of that before Jesus ever was sent to die for our sins. My church just did a really great sermon about God's being internal and how that kind of can impact our lives and how we can look at that. Not really being able to wrap our mind around eternity, but still understanding God's power in that. So I'll link to that sermon down below if that's something that you are interested in or you want to learn more about. It's pretty short and it's a really, really good sermon. So if you want to watch it, I'll link it down below. Okay, so now that we kind of broke that down verse by verse, we're just going to go through this kind of as a whole idea that God cares about us and that we can surrender to his power. So God knows all of our struggles and he doesn't expect us to suck it up or find the silver lining in life, even when it feels like everything is hitting the fan at once. God sent his son to live as a man on earth so that he could fully understand all of the pains and all of the suffering of being human that God might not have been able to understand before that. So when Jesus came and lived as a man, he experienced the same suffering. He experienced the same temptations that we experience today, now in our life. And he doesn't make things happen, like I said before, but he will use those evil things for good and for his own glory. All he asks us to do is to lean on him, the one creator who knows you intimately. And there's a really good verse, so what I'll do, we'll reference it right here. Go look at Romans 8:28 that talks about how God knows us intimately and how we can lean on him during suffering, even when we don't understand the point of suffering. Another great verse is Matthew 26:38, that even though Jesus suffered more than any other man because he took on all of our sins before he died, Jesus trusted that his plan was good. He trusted in his Father, and he knew that even though the suffering was going to be the absolute worst kind of suffering that any man could ever experience, this plan led us to our freedom today. And we're told to do the same with our suffering. Just understand that the suffering that you feel can feel overwhelming and completely jaw-dropping and shocking to you now, and it can shake your entire world and turn lives upside down. But God can use any suffering for his good. And like I said, even if you don't see it in this lifetime, he will use it for good. Suffering isn't a tool of punishment. So we'll do this here. And you can see how suffering is not punishment in the book of Job. That entire story is all about a man who suffers for absolutely no reason, and his friends try to understand why he's suffering. And it's such an important book to read, especially if you're going through something hard right now, because Job suffers just so that he can grow closer to God. And suffering is not a punishment, as I talk about in Luke 13:2-5. But it can be an opportunity to lean on God and step into your faith. So I'm just going to write the main idea here. All right, you guys, that is it for this one. I'll go ahead and highlight all of the verses. As usual, all of the tools that I'm using will be linked down below, and you can download this in a PDF version to see all of my notes. If it's hard to read on the screen, I'll link to that down below. Thank you for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video.